The cries of the rancher's baby echoed through the wooden walls of the homestead, a desperate wail that refused to be soothed. Day turned to night, and night to another weary dawn, yet the child's voice never quieted. The rancher, strong in the saddle and fierce in the fields, now found himself powerless before the fragile life he held in his arms. Neighbors came and went with advice, offering remedies brewed from roots and whispers, but nothing brought peace. The house that once stood as a fortress of pride now trembled beneath the sound of helpless tears. Word spread quickly across the prairie, as it always did, reaching even the poorest corners of the land. Among those who heard was a widow, a woman weathered by hardship, her hands rough from labor, her heart scarred by loss. She owned little more than the clothes on her back and the memory of a family she once held. Yet there was something in her presence, something quiet and unshakable, that made others pause. While most dismissed her as insignificant, she carried with her the kind of knowledge the West often forgot, wisdom born from suffering and love shaped by survival. When she stepped onto the rancher's porch, her figure small against the vast horizon, the guests already gathered scoffed. How could a woman who owned nothing bring what wealth and reputation cannot? But the widow did not flinch beneath their stares. She heard the baby's cries from within, cries that carried both desperation and a plea. Without asking permission, she crossed the threshold, her worn boots tapping softly against the floor. Pride had failed, remedies had failed, yet hope walked in quietly with her. Inside, the rancher stood exhausted, his arms heavy, his face hollow from sleepless nights. He looked at the widow with doubt, almost ready to dismiss her as the others had. But something in her eyes stopped him, something steady, something that spoke of storms survived and fires endured. She did not speak promises, nor did she boast of skill. She simply reached out her arms, asking silently for the child. And though his pride resisted, desperation overcame him. He placed the crying baby into her hands. The moment the child touched her chest, something shifted. Her heartbeat, steady as the land itself, seemed to wrap around the infant like a blanket no wealth could buy. She rocked gently, whispering words too soft for anyone to hear, words born from a heart that had once known both motherhood and loss. Slowly, the cries began to fade, replaced by quiet breaths and fragile peace. The room, once filled with chaos, fell silent. And in that silence, the rancher and his guests saw not a poor widow, but a miracle walking on two weary feet. The silence that followed the baby's sudden calm was heavier than the prairie night. The rancher, who had spent endless hours pacing the floor, could only stare in disbelief. His hands, rough from years of roping cattle, trembled as he lowered them to his sides. For the first time in days, the cries that had haunted every corner of the house were gone. All that remained was the faint, steady breath of his child resting against the widow's chest. It felt less like an act of care and more like a miracle carved from sorrow. The guests who had scoffed at her arrival now sat speechless, their arrogance stripped away in an instant. They had mocked her poverty, whispered about her loneliness, and dismissed her presence as worthless. Yet here she was, accomplishing what wealth, remedies, and reputation had all failed to do. Their laughter turned to shame as they realized they had witnessed something they could neither explain nor deny. The poor widow, once invisible, now stood as the savior of the rancher's most precious life. The widow did not smile, nor did she bask in recognition. Her eyes remained lowered, her lips whispering words too soft for anyone else to catch. She rocked gently, her movements calm and sure, as if she had done this 1,000 times before. And in truth, she had, though for children who no longer lived to hear her lullabies. The strength she carried came not from pride but from grief, a grief that had carved into her heart a tenderness no one else could understand. The rancher's wife, exhausted and broken from nights without rest, collapsed into a chair, tears spilling freely down her cheeks. For days she had prayed for relief, her body and spirit stretched to breaking. Now, watching her child sleep against the widow's chest, she felt both gratitude and guilt. Gratitude that her baby finally rested, guilt that it was not her arms, but the arms of another woman that had brought peace. Yet beneath the sting of that realization lay a truth she could not ignore. Love, no matter its source, was the only thing strong enough to quiet suffering. The West was a land of dust and survival, where storms broke fences and men measured worth by strength. But that night, strength was not found in rifles or cattle herds. It was found in the embrace of a widow who owned nothing yet gave everything. And as the house sat in stillness, the rancher and his guests realized they were witnessing not just the quieting of a child, but the revelation of something far greater, the power of love born from loss. The rancher approached slowly, his boots echoing against the wooden floor. His pride, so often his armor, now felt like a shackle. He had doubted her, dismissed her, even allowed others to ridicule her presence. Yet in this moment, he could not deny the truth standing before him. He knelt beside the widow, his voice breaking as he whispered, "How did you do it?" But she only shook her head, brushing a strand of hair from the baby's face, and replied softly, "It wasn't me. It was love he needed, not medicine." Those words struck harder than any bullet. The rancher realized that for all his wealth, for all his power, he had overlooked the simplest truth. His child did not need status, nor remedies bought in town. He needed the warmth of arms that carried tenderness, the steady rhythm of a heart that knew how to endure pain. The West was harsh, but the human heart, when opened, could still work miracles no coin could buy. The rancher bowed his head, ashamed that it had taken him so long to see what was before him. The guests, still gathered awkwardly in the room, shifted uncomfortably. None dared to meet the widow's gaze. Their fine clothes and polished boots felt hollow, stripped of meaning before the quiet miracle they had just witnessed. For once, no one spoke. The silence itself became a judgment, a reminder that the poor widow they had scorned had revealed the truth of their own emptiness. Pride had failed them. Only humility could restore their dignity. The rancher's wife rose unsteadily, her hands trembling as she reached toward the widow. She expected resistance, perhaps even resentment, but the widow met her with a gentle smile and placed the baby carefully into her arms. "He is yours," she said, "but remember this moment. Sometimes it takes another's pain to calm what we cannot bear alone." The wife's tears fell onto her child's cheeks as she realized the depth of what had been given, a gift far greater than silence, a gift of healing carried by hands that knew loss. Outside, the wind swept across the prairie, rattling the shutters as if to remind them that storms were never far. But inside, peace had settled for the first time in days. The poor widow, with nothing but her presence, had restored what wealth could not. And though the night was not yet over, every soul in that room knew it would be remembered forever as the night a miracle was worked not by power, but by the strength of a heart that had already broken and learned to love again. The following day, the ranch was alive with whispers. Word of the widow's miracle had spread beyond the wooden walls of the homestead, carried across fences and along dirt roads by every tongue that had witnessed it. Neighbors arrived under the guise of offering help, but their eyes searched only for the woman whose touch had calmed the rancher's child. Some came out of curiosity, others out of skepticism, but all were drawn by the same quiet truth. Something extraordinary had happened, and it had not been wrought by wealth or power, but by a woman the town had long ignored. The widow did not bask in the attention. She kept to herself, her head bowed as she moved about the house, doing small chores without being asked. She had no interest in glory, nor did she claim to have performed anything miraculous. In her heart, she knew that what others called a miracle was simply the outpouring of love she had carried since the day she lost her own child. The West had taken much from her, but it had also left her with a well of tenderness so deep that even the cries of another woman's baby could be stilled by it. The rancher struggled with the weight of humility. He had allowed pride to blind him, to dismiss her as worthless, even as he and his wife crumbled under the relentless cries of their child. Now, each time he looked at the widow, he saw a mirror held up to his own failings. She had given freely what he had refused to acknowledge, the truth that strength was not measured in land or cattle, but in compassion. It was a lesson the West rarely taught, and it stung sharper than the crack of a whip. At supper that evening, the guests who had once mocked her sat uneasily at the table. Their laughter, once loud and careless, was replaced by silence and downcast eyes. They remembered too vividly how they had sneered when she first arrived, how they had doubted her worth, only to be proven wrong before their very eyes. No apology was spoken, but their shame filled the room as tangibly as the scent of bread on the table. The widow, as if sensing their unease, asked for nothing and offered nothing in return but her quiet presence. The rancher's wife, however, could not contain her gratitude. She reached across the table, her hand trembling as she touched the widow's. "I will never forget what you did," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. For the first time in days, her eyes carried light instead of exhaustion. The widow simply nodded, her lips curving into the faintest smile, as though to say that no thanks were needed. She had given what she could, not for recognition, but because the cries of a child had called out to her heart. But the prairie is never still, and whispers soon gave rise to judgment. Some neighbors claimed it was no miracle at all, but trickery. Others, fearful of what they could not explain, muttered that the widow had used charms or spells learned from old wanderers of the plains. The West was a land quick to turn suspicion into condemnation, and while some marveled at her gift, others began to fear it. In the eyes of many, poverty and mystery walked too closely together. The rancher felt the stirrings of anger when these rumors reached his ears. He knew what he had seen, knew the peace she had brought to his home, and yet he also understood the power of gossip in a land where fear often outweighed reason. To defend her openly would be to risk his own reputation, but to remain silent would be to betray the truth she had revealed. He stood at a crossroads between pride and courage, and the choice pressed heavily against him. The widow, however, seemed untouched by the whispers. She had endured worse in her years of solitude: hunger, grief, and the cold stares of those who judge without understanding. What were rumors to a woman who had already lost everything? Yet still, a shadow lingered over her heart. She feared not for herself, but for the fragile peace she had brought into the rancher's home. Suspicion, if left to fester, could undo what love had healed. The rancher's wife grew restless at the thought of losing her presence. She clung to the memory of her baby's calm, the miracle that had spared her from despair. "We need her," she told her husband one evening, her voice trembling. "Not just for the baby, for us. Don't let their words drive her away." It was a plea not only for gratitude, but for survival. In her eyes, the widow was no longer an outsider, but a lifeline. The man sat in silence, staring into the fire. The flames cracked and hissed like the voices outside their walls. He knew the truth. The West had little mercy for those who stood apart. To protect the widow would demand more than quiet gratitude. It would demand defiance. And as the firelight danced across his face, he realized that the test before him was greater than calming a child. It was whether he had the courage to stand for what was right, even when the entire prairie turned its gaze against him. The days that followed brought an uneasy quiet. The baby slept soundly now, his cries stilled as if some invisible weight had been lifted. Yet outside the ranch walls, whispers swirled like a gathering storm. Men at the saloon muttered that no poor widow should wield such mysterious power, while women at the well spoke in hushed tones of spells and shadows. What had begun as awe twisted slowly into suspicion, for the West was a land where anything unexplained was treated as danger. The widow moved with the same quiet grace, tending to the child when needed, mending small tasks around the ranch. She neither defended herself nor addressed the rumors. Her silence unsettled many, for people feared what they could not name. Still, her presence remained a balm within the home, her touch a comfort that neither wealth nor medicine could provide. To the rancher's family, she was no longer an outsider. She was kin in everything but name. The rancher's wife found strength in her company. Together they shared moments of fragile peace, washing clothes by the river, kneading bread in the kitchen, rocking the baby under the fading glow of sunset. Each time the child slept in the widow's arms, the mother's heart broke and healed at once. Broke because it reminded her of her own weakness, healed because it proved she was not alone. Gratitude and grief mingled in her soul, yet above them both rose a quiet reverence. The rancher himself wrestled with his pride. He was a man who had always relied on strength and status, yet he had seen both fail before his child's cries. The widow's gift humbled him daily, reminding him of the limits of his own power. Neighbors expected him to cast her aside to silence the rumors, but each time he looked at his son's sleeping face, he knew he could not. His silence before them became his first act of defiance. But the prairie has little patience for silence. One evening, as the sky burned red with sunset, riders appeared at the fence line. Their eyes were sharp, their voices edged with accusation. They demanded to know what kind of spell the widow had cast, why the child now slept when no remedy had worked before. Suspicion had hardened into confrontation, and the rancher knew that his choice could no longer be delayed. The air grew heavy as the riders dismounted, dust rising beneath their boots. The widow stood in the doorway, calm as stone, though the shadows in her eyes betrayed the pain of old wounds reopened. She had been judged before, by neighbors, by strangers, by the harsh tongue of grief itself. But never had she felt such piercing doubt, aimed at the very love she had offered freely. Still, she did not flinch. She had nothing left to fear, nothing left to lose. The rancher stepped forward, his voice steady though his heart thundered. "She saved my child," he said firmly, his gaze sweeping across the men. "And I will not hear another word against her." His declaration cut through the murmurs like a rifle shot. The guests who had once scoffed now watched with wide eyes, shocked to hear him defend the woman he had once dismissed. It was a line drawn in the dust, and everyone present knew it. The leader of the riders spat into the dirt, his face twisted with scorn. "You're blind, rancher. She bewitched that baby, and you'll pay the price when the truth comes due." His words dripped with the venom of fear disguised as certainty. But the rancher did not waver. For the first time, he realized that true strength was not in bending others through fear, but in standing firm for what love had revealed. The widow's eyes softened as she looked at the man who now stood before her. He was no longer the proud figure who had once allowed others to mock her. He was changed, humbled, and perhaps stronger for it. In his stance, she saw not only defense but also respect, something she had not been given in years. And though the riders' accusations stung, their bitterness could not pierce the fragile unity now growing inside the ranch walls. The prairie wind howled across the fields as night fell, carrying the tension into the darkness. The riders mounted again, muttering threats as they disappeared into the distance. The rancher knew this was not the end, only the beginning of a longer struggle. But as he turned to see his wife holding their sleeping child, and the widow standing steady by their side, he understood something vital. Some battles were not fought with guns or fists, but with the courage to love in the face of suspicion. The following days were heavy with unease. The rancher worked the fields, but his mind stayed on the riders' threats. He knew the prairie well. Fear rarely died quietly, and suspicion often returned sharper than before. The neighbors no longer came to offer help or to gossip openly. Instead, they watched from a distance, their glances sharp as barbed wire, their whispers carried on the wind. The ranch had become a place of both peace and danger, where love had soothed the child but pride and fear now circled like vultures. The widow did not waver. She continued her work in silence, tending the child, cooking meals, and mending small things that needed care. To her, the judgment of others was nothing new. She had lived too long with empty cupboards and cold nights to be shaken by harsh words. Yet she noticed how the rancher's wife grew anxious, how her hands trembled each time hoofbeats sounded on the road. Fear had a way of seeping into walls, and the house itself seemed to hold its breath. The baby, however, thrived. His cheeks grew rosy, his cries now rare, his sleep deep and steady. Each night, as the widow rocked him under the soft glow of the lantern, the rancher and his wife watched in quiet awe. They no longer doubted that what had happened was more than coincidence. It was not a spell, nor a trick. It was love, steady and unyielding, poured into fragile life. The truth was simple, yet the world outside their walls refused to accept it. One evening, as the family gathered at the table, the boy asked a question that cut through the silence like a blade. Why do they hate her if she saved us? His innocence exposed the raw wound in the room, forcing the adults to confront what they feared to speak. The widow lowered her gaze, her lips pressed tight, while the rancher struggled to find an answer. How could he explain that the West often feared what it did not understand, that pride disguised itself as judgment, and that love was the rarest thing of all. The rancher finally spoke, his voice heavy but firm. "They don't hate her, son," he said. "They hate the truth she carries, the truth that their strength isn't enough." His words silenced the room. For the first time, he admitted what had haunted him, that his wealth, his land, and his pride had all been powerless, while a poor widow had held the miracle in her arms. It was a confession not just to his son, but to himself. That night, the prairie wind roared against the windows, rattling the shutters like a warning. The rancher sat awake, his rifle across his lap, though he knew bullets would do little against the whispers that threatened them. His wife sat beside him, the baby in her arms, while the widow tended the fire. The flickering flames threw shadows across the room, shadows that seemed to echo the uncertainty pressing in from the outside. Yet within those walls, there was a fragile strength that no rumor could shatter. The widow finally broke her silence, her voice steady though her eyes were distant. "They will not stop," she said. "Fear doesn't rest until it burns itself out." She spoke not with bitterness, but with the calm of someone who had endured storms before. Her words carried the weight of truth the rancher did not want to hear. He looked at her, wondering how much pain her quiet strength had cost, and realized he had never truly seen her until now. The rancher's wife reached across the table, her hand covering the widow's. "You're not alone anymore," she whispered. It was a vow, fragile but powerful, spoken not just for the widow, but for herself. She had been saved by this woman, her child's life steadied by her arms, and she would not allow suspicion to steal that away. For the first time, she felt less like a victim of circumstance, and more like a fighter standing alongside the widow. The baby stirred softly, then fell back into peaceful sleep, the rise and fall of his chest steady as the rhythm of a prayer. The sight drew tears to the widow's eyes, though she quickly brushed them away. In the child's calm, she felt both joy and sorrow, joy that she could give him peace, sorrow for the child she had lost to silence years before. It was a wound that never healed, yet in giving love to another's child, she found the strength to carry it. As dawn broke, painting the horizon with streaks of gold, the rancher stepped outside and looked across the vast prairie. He knew the riders would return, and the whispers might never fade. But he also knew this. His family was no longer broken, and the widow's presence had given them more than peace. She had given them courage to face whatever storm came next. And in the Old West, courage was often the only weapon worth carrying. The tension reached its peak when the riders returned, this time not with whispers, but with open hostility. Dust rose behind their horses as they thundered toward the ranch, their faces grim, their voices sharp with accusation. They dismounted in a fury, demanding the widow be cast out before her unnatural powers cursed the land. Their words cut like knives, but beneath them lay only fear, a fear of what they could not control, of a love too deep to explain. The rancher stood firm at the gate, his hand steady on the post, his rifle slung across his shoulder. He did not raise it, for he knew bullets could not silence suspicion, but his stance carried the weight of a man who would not yield. "This ranch will not turn her away," he declared, his voice steady as stone. "She saved my son. That's the only truth that matters here." The men muttered among themselves, their pride bruised by his defiance, but the fire in his eyes warned them this battle would not be won easily. The widow stepped forward then, her presence quiet yet commanding. She did not shout, nor did she defend herself with long speeches. She simply raised the sleeping baby in her arms, his breath soft and steady, his peace undeniable. "Does this look like a curse to you?" she asked, her voice calm but piercing. The child's innocence silenced the crowd more effectively than any rifle shot could have. For a moment, even the most hardened rider could not deny the truth before him. The rancher's wife joined her, standing shoulder to shoulder with the widow. "This woman is family now," she said firmly, "and I will not let fear tear this home apart." Her voice cracked, but her courage was clear. Together, the two women stood like a wall against the storm, their unity of force stronger than suspicion. The guests who once doubted now shifted uneasily, realizing that pride and gossip had no place in the face of such defiance. The riders, faced with silence they could not shake and truth they could not bend, turned their horses with curses on their lips. They disappeared into the prairie, but their anger lingered like thunder on the horizon. The danger was not gone, but the moment had changed everything. The rancher, his wife, and the widow had stood together, and in their unity, they discovered the strength to endure whatever storms would follow. That night, the house glowed with a quiet strength. The baby slept soundly, the widow rocked by the fire, and the rancher and his wife sat close, their hearts heavy yet steadied by resolve. They knew the prairie would not forget quickly, that suspicion would return like the relentless wind, but for the first time they did not fear it. What had once been a house divided by pride and despair was now bound by something far greater: love, fragile yet unbreakable. The rancher reflected on his journey, on the shame of his doubts, and the arrogance that had blinded him. He realized that the miracle had not been only in the calming of his child, but in the transformation of his own heart. He had learned that wealth could not command peace, and pride could not quiet fear. Only humility, only the gift of another's love, could restore what had been broken. It was a truth the West rarely admitted, yet one he would carry forever. The widow, sitting quietly by the fire, felt a peace she had not known in years. She had given what she could, her love, her presence, her strength carved from grief, and in return she had found something unexpected: belonging. For so long, she had been a shadow, unseen and unwanted. Now, though whispers still followed her, she had a place where her heart was not only heard but needed. For her, that was the greatest miracle of all. The boy, too young to understand the weight of it all, played at his mother's feet, humming softly. To him, the widow was simply someone who loved, someone who stayed, someone who turned fear into calm. In his innocence lay the clearest vision of truth, that love was not measured by what one owned, but by what one gave. And he would grow up remembering not the whispers of fear, but the strength of a woman who had healed his family's home. Outside, the prairie stretched endless and vast, the stars burning like eternal watchmen in the sky. Storms would come again, as they always did, but within the walls of the ranch, a new foundation had been laid. It was not built of land or cattle, but of courage, humility, and love. And as the fire crackled into the night, they knew that this miracle, born from the arms of a poor widow, would echo across the West long after the whispers had faded. The story of the rancher's baby did not end with the silencing of his cries. It became a reminder that true strength is not found in wealth, nor in pride, but in the willingness to love when the world least expects it. A poor widow, who had lost everything, gave the only thing she had left: the tenderness of her heart. And in doing so, she revealed a truth the West often hides beneath its dust and silence: that miracles are born not of riches or power, but of compassion. The rancher and his wife learned that humility can heal where pride cannot. Their child's peace was not bought with remedies nor secured by strength of arms, but given freely through the hands of someone they once overlooked. In that moment, their home was transformed, not only because the baby slept, but because their eyes were opened. They discovered that sometimes the greatest blessings arrive in the most unexpected forms. The whispers of the prairie never ceased completely. Fear rarely does. But inside the walls of the ranch, a new foundation was laid. The widow was no longer an outsider, but a part of their story, a symbol of endurance and grace. And though the neighbors might doubt, the rancher's family would always remember the night their despair was replaced by hope. It was a lesson stronger than any storm: that love, even when born from loss, can heal the deepest wounds. For the widow, the miracle was not in silencing a child, but in being seen again, recognized not for what she lacked, but for what she carried within her. In giving peace, she found belonging, and in offering love, she discovered that her pain had a purpose. Her story reminds us that even broken hearts can become vessels of healing, and even the most overlooked lives can change the fate of others. And for us, this tale leaves a question that lingers long after the fire burns out. How often do we dismiss the very people who hold the key to our healing? In the end, it is not status that saves us, but love. If this story spoke to your heart, share your thoughts in the comments, and let us know which moment touched you most. And if you wish to keep walking with us through more powerful tales of the Old West, filled with lessons of hope, redemption, and resilience, make sure to subscribe and leave a like. Together, we keep these stories alive, carrying their truths into every tomorrow.